You gave me an idea of how to measure something, which is in a very different domain called the operational domain. And very often there is confusion between the conceptual and the operational. But let me give you a very simple example. If you're giving me a job talk and I'm going to say, I want to know what you mean by empowerment. And your response is, let me tell you how I measure it. That's not my question. My question is a conceptual one. And you're telling me how to measure something. That's not my question. That's in a different domain. How you measure something is in a different domain than the construct itself, right? And so that is what I want to emphasize in terms of these two domains. You're going to see how it can get quite confusing. And so I'm going to have a few more questions along the way about this. So what is the constitutive definition and what's the operational definition? All right. And what is the distinction between measured and experimental operational definitions? So think about this. Anybody here interested in manipulating your variable versus measuring it? And my sense is a lot of you are interested in measuring it, but the same principles apply if you want to manipulate something. So just to give you an example, you have a donation behavior. So you could even manipulate something like that into something where you use a prime or something and say, make somebody donate more versus less, or express a higher intention and a lower intention. And so that's your independent variable in an experiment. So you can take a lot of these things and manipulate it as well. Let's do a thought experiment, all right? A lot of you think you're going to measure your variable. I'm going to ask you to manipulate it, meaning it's an experimental setting. You're looking at internationalization. So how are you going to manipulate internationalization? Maybe you can use a scenario. Maybe you can use something like that. But how are you going to manipulate it in a setting? It could be real setting, artificial setting. You could do a quasi experiment and say, well, I'm going to look at companies that didn't internationalize and those that did. That's where the independent variable, you're finding 2 or 3 categories of that independent variable, and that would make it an experimental operational definition. So shall we do one more? And this is probably better for your notes, where I want you to think about this and say, if I were manipulating my variable, this is what I'll be doing instead of measuring it, all right? And so for example, if I were to go back on the slides to the word cloud that you had earlier, so you look at satisfaction, right? And you could manipulate satisfaction. Let's say it's consumer satisfaction. So you could say, well, I'm going to give you a scenario where a consumer is very satisfied, and I'm going to give somebody else a scenario where they're not satisfied. So, and imagine you're that customer, right? So that would be an example. Or it could be something like empathy. You prime it, you do something where you know it'll lead to more empathy versus less. And then you follow that along. So you can take any measured variable and figure out a way to manipulate it, or vice versa. What you're really doing in manipulation is you're categorizing it, and then you are basically finding a way to elicit it. And in a quasi experiment, you could be comparing companies. You could say, here are companies that have internationalized on these criteria, and here are companies that have not internationalized. I'm going to compare them, except that's not an pure experiment. But you can certainly compare and say they differ on all these other things, but I'm going to approach it like an experiment, right? So that mentality is very important as well. So we talked about what is a construct, why is it called a construct, what's the distinction between, and I asked you to develop a figure of your construct and develop one hypothesis about the relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable, using your concept as the independent variable. To be honest with you, you could have done either. So I would love to see you now relate 2 different variables. And again, I'm starting, as far as measurement is concerned, I want to start at a level where we can all move along together, but we can get as advanced as we want, at least in terms of the design of measurement. So now the next thing I'm going to ask you for is a hypothesis that relates your variables, relate 2 variables to each other that are of interest to you.